Hey, I'm a game developer that makes games as quickly as possible, and today I'm going to teach you how to easily design depth in your game to improve your players' engagement by a lot. Let me go ahead and start off with this question. Here in this clip, you can see that every time you press left or right, your player basically moves left or right. Pretty simple stuff, right? What can we do to make this more engaging and more expressive without adding anything else? What if I told you for every time we took a hop, we did like a little brief iframe? We basically become invincible every time this occurs. And we're trying not to overscope by adding these features, but the whole point is this entire premise of just adding a side effect is basically the premise of depth. In other words, depth is basically when you have a single input that has the ability to produce more than one output. And the reason why this is so important is because games that have a lot of great depth design allows for higher player expression. You have more unique interactions. You have a very flexible game as a whole, which leads to players being more invested into the gameplay, makes the game more memorable, and as a result, more fun. As well, if you are a indie developer specifically working on anything that has customization, you are required to have a strong depth design to make sure that your game feels as deep as possible. And lastly, there are a lot of notorious games that feel like they have endless options because of all of the depth designs that are intentionally added in the game. Being said, what does depth actually look like? And it's very simple. It's just a simple, hey, we have an input and an output, but also there's this side effect that feels unintentional. And that's kind of the key to this. So if we think about something like, Dark Souls, you use a button and you do an attack. That's basically the input and the output. But the side effect is as you do the attack, you are halted, you have this long animation, you're vulnerable. There's a lot of factors that you have to kind of worry for, even though all you're doing is attacking, right? And so, as a developer, it's your goal to build systems that allow you to kind of emphasize that secondary or third effect while you're intentionally just doing one main mechanic. So, to design depth or the framework that we will be using, all we have to do is ask ourselves these very simple questions, right? Number one is the input, which is, hey, what is the player trying to do, right? Like, what are we trying to get them to do? What is the mechanic? What is the tool? That's where we start off with, all right? And then the second part, pretty simple. What happens when they press that button or use that tool? And this is where we use our game logic, right? So, like I said, if I did a jump button, right? Well, if I press A, then I want to perform a jump. Pretty simple, right? The key here is using the same programming, right? Using the same game logic. How can we add a bonus consequence, right? And by the way, we need to use and exaggerate the fact that we need to use the same game logic because if we just continue to add and add and add, we're going to overscope and that's going to be an issue not only for the development and the production cycle, but also the game becomes a little bit way more complicated than it should be, all right? So just to bear in mind, rules are going to be bent but not broken. So in other words, try to figure out like, hey, what can I do to like really leverage what I currently have without adding as much as I need to. So basically, this is the framework that you're going to use. You have an input, an output, and the game logic has the ability to produce another output using the exact same logic. All right. There's this other video that I made called Making Any Game Mechanic Goated, which has a downloadable worksheet. It also talks about risk and reward within gameplay mechanics. Heavily recommend you checking out the description down below to go ahead and see this video and the resource, as there are a lot of examples that kind of go into depth. But this video is going to go ahead and talk more about the types of depth that you have to pay attention to. All right. So let's begin with classic. And what is classic? Again, just what we described. We have an input, we have an output, and there's something that happens to feel like a bonus. And the best example that I can think of is, hey, every time you move, you get this iframe. So if we plug in exactly our actions in the little chart, well, our input is left and right, our output is movement. But every time we also press left and right, we get one frame of invincibility. And this is basically a classic example of what it would look like. Now, there are other more complicated ways to design depth, and we're going to go ahead and talk about the next one, which is the passive attribute or something known as ailments. So instead of directly pressing a button or an event, by having an object that simply exists, think about like a passive upgrade or something, you have the ability to, gain something, but there's also other properties that you can pay attention to. So for this example, let's talk about weapons, right? If my character is moving around the field without a weapon, well, I can't really prepare an attack, but also I'm just moving at a normal speed. Now, let's say I am holding a weapon and I decide to move. In this case, I'll go ahead and move a little slower than usual, and that's because the weapon I'm holding actually has weight. So now we have a property that we're paying attention to. At the same time, I need the weapon to actually prepare an attack and do what I have to do. Now, if we play these clips side by side, you can clearly see that holding the weapon just makes me slightly slower, And it's not too much of an issue, right? As in, it's probably barely much of a difference, and it probably doesn't matter in the big picture, except it does. And the reason why is because it allows players to ask questions. Hey, are there heavier attacks? Are there heavier weapons? Like, are there any other weapons that would make me faster? Would I want to include this weapon in my toolkit because, like it slows me down? What if I found an ability that makes me go faster? There's going to be a lot of things to play around with when it comes to the property of weight. So all we really did is say, hey, if you hold this weapon, weight increases. Maybe there's another weapon where the weight decreases. And again, all we did is just tweak one little variable, and now you have this, passive element that you're watching out for. All right. Again, that leads to a lot of depthful gameplay that players have to pay attention to going forward. Another example is what's called two birds, one stone, which is what would happen if you link one button that does like an output, and that same button also happens to do another output, right? And this is basically like a coinciding effect of like, oh, well, A is jump, but also A is attack. How would that work, right? So one example, and this is like a very niche one, is in Deltarune, Chapter 3 specifically. There's a section where you get to play as Susie, and if you look at an item and press the A button, you're able to pluck it. All right, you're able to like grab the object. At the same time, the A button is used to talk. You can go ahead and find and interact with other objects, and when you press A, you get dialogue, you get these little speeches, you learn more about all these things. There's a very unique interaction that happens that leads to a secret path, no spoilers, kind of, where you talk to this fence thing that says, hey, it's like a sign that you talk to, but then by you pressing the button, you're also plucking it and getting it out of the way. And suddenly you have the secret path that you can explore. So even though this is like a very niche example, this is an example of, hey, one button can do two things, and that creates depthful design. Another source of depth is actually known as dynamic interactions. This one's pretty straightforward. It just talks about, hey, for every time you do something, there is an output, but the output kind of greatly changes depending on your environment or conditions of what's going on. And I think the best way to explain this is with this Pokemon move known as Weather Ball, right? Weather Ball, 50 damage, normal type attack, very simple and very straightforward. But if you had the sun, or if it was raining, if there's any type of weather that is active in the game, not only would the move double in power, but it would also change its type. The input is you're just using Weather Ball, that's it. But the output greatly changes based off if it's sunny, if it's raining, if there's no weather, if there's an ability that cancels weather, like Cloud9, for example, right? So this is something that, again, has a lot of depth because it changes based off of other conditions that you go through. Another source of depth is known as board state manipulation, which basically is, hey, your intention of doing something does, what you want, but there's this background effect that massively changes the game. So in my game Dodge King, when you collect an upgrade, the game naturally gets more difficult. Vice versa, if you don't pick up the upgrade, you actually make the game easier, but you're also giving yourself kind of like a handicap mode because, with the less upgrades you have, the more difficult the game naturally is. Point being, the more you collect, the more difficult the game becomes. And so, in a way, you collect the upgrade to get bonus points, to get more health, to get more defense. But indirectly, you're just making the game way more difficult for yourself. And that's board state manipulation. Speaking of board state manipulation, there's this other form of depth called secondary first, where it's kind of like the same thing, but you actually just want to use this mechanic so that you use the bonus or the consequence rather than the actual like reason why the mechanic exists in the first place. And I genuinely believe the best example for this is when you look at Smash Bros. Recovery, right? In Smash, you can use a special attack, a normal attack. The whole game is about fighting, basically, right? So when you put an input, you are dealing damage. And so there's this one particular input known as up B or up special, where basically, yeah, you do an attack, but that attack is always associated with getting some height or doing something to get back on the stage. In other words, up B on paper, yeah, it's an attack, it does damage, it does what it has to do, but you typically, like 90% of the time, you only use it exclusively to just get back to the stage and recover. And so this is an example of secondary first where, the intention is attacking, but the true intention actually is the secondary like height effect that you pay attention to. Another really good example with this, and my bad, don't want to bring Pokemon up again, but there's this move called Fake Out. It's a weak normal type attack. It does 40 damage. It's not really important. You can only use it once per turn or once at the start of your turn. It's weird. But there's this secondary effect where you flinch your opponent, which basically means you kind of cancel their first turn, which can be huge in a like doubles battle context, right? And so the output here is, oh, Fake Out damage, like that's it. But the bonus is the flinch that just absolutely changes the board state and kind of just like how you go forward. All right. Now, there's a few more examples of that we're going to briefly go through here. And this is going to get a little convoluted, but all you need to recognize is, hey, input equals output, but output has this side effect. Okay. So this one is tech. And tech is actually what happens when the outputs become the inputs to create a new output. In other words, what would happen if I did multiple movements that had multiple outputs, but those combination of outputs created what's called a tech output? And this is very commonly found in speedrunners or, in a speedrun or in a fighting game, right? So for example, in this clip for Super Mario Odyssey, right, you have this really unique movement where you do a triple jump, a cap throw, a wall jump. You then look up, do a cappy throw, then you do a back dive, and all this leads to an upwards aerial momentum that allows you to get up to this roof. Naturally, you can do this in the game, but notice how many inputs have to be placed back to back to back to create this like upwards movement, right? And so that's an example of a tech. But speaking of fighting games and Smash Bros itself, Melee has this thing called wave dashing, where you basically do like a micro jump, then you angle kind of like back onto the ground, you go for an air dodge, and as soon as you hit the ground, you do like this tech or like another button press. The whole point is wave dashing is literally trying to like speed up the process of you moving as quickly as possible, but it can only happen after you do like a combination of 4 inputs at the exact same time to get this sequence of events that allows you to wave dash. Very complicated, but also like one of the fundamentals of why this game is like extremely interactive and dynamic, right? It's that depth of what would happen if I just kept on spamming these buttons to get these cool results, right? Then we have the last two. Ironic output, which is basically, hey, like you actually don't want to do this, but by doing so, you get a bonus or a benefit. And so, super brief example, let's say the shield button, right? You want a shield to block attacks as much as possible, right? But what if I told you, hey, if you lose your shield, you actually increase your speed because you just don't have weight, like you just lost weight and now you're like faster or something, right? So that's kind of like ironic because you want to block as much as possible, but it is what it is. So that's an example. And then finally, the last one is what's called trade depth, which is kind of like in a game that has any type of inventory or economical system. Think about farming, builder, simulations, games that kind of depend a lot on crafting. I think the best example here would be Minecraft, right? Where your objective is you collect items, and that's kind of just what it is. You do attacks, you kind of chop up wood, right? Like there's a lot of inputs for that, and your output is to collect a singular item. But the thing is, if you were to do, again, crafting or merging or the meshing of these multiple items, you can create new items, right? And so in this particular example, this isn't necessarily super like in depth, but because, it's basically output plus output equals new output. So it could kind of be like a tech. But the whole point is that the depth actually comes into how you create something based off of what resources you have available for you. That's the one thing that you have to pay very close attention to. And Minecraft is a very great example of this. So these are all the examples of depth or the types of depth that you can go ahead and do. Go ahead and pause the video and take a screenshot of this if you want to kind of like see the breakdown once again. And finally, if this video helped you, please go ahead and subscribe, check out the channel, and again, check the link in the description down below to check out the Goated Game Mechanics, which has the worksheet, has another explanation on how to improve your game mechanics as a whole, and just extra resources that you might find available that are going to be very useful for you. All right, hope this helped.